Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the Middle Ages to discover how people tried to cure one of humanity's oldest companions, anxiety. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. And hopefully none of you are watching this because your local barber has also offered to be your therapist. Imagine you wake up somewhere in medieval Europe. The sun hasn't risen yet, the fire has almost gone out, and your blanket has all the insulating power of an enthusiastic napkin. Before you've even opened the front door, your brain has already started today's worrying schedule. Will the harvest survive? Will your cow survive? Will you survive? Will your landlord invent another tax? And why has your neighbour started coughing in a way that sounds expensive? Welcome to medieval anxiety. The people around you wouldn't call it that, of course. The word didn't exist in the way we use it today. But they absolutely recognise the feeling. Your heart races for no obvious reason. Your stomach feels tied into knots. You lie awake staring at the ceiling, which, fortunately, is interesting enough because there are at least 3 spiders negotiating ownership of it. You can't concentrate. Every small problem suddenly feels like the beginning of the apocalypse. To be fair, in the Middle Ages, it occasionally was. Unlike today, you can't distract yourself by scrolling your phone for 2 hours, pretending you'll go to bed after just one more video. Instead, you get to stare into a fire while your brain helpfully reminds you of every bad thing that has ever happened, and every bad thing that could happen. Human beings, it turns out, have always been remarkably talented at manufacturing disasters that haven't happened yet. The difference is that medieval people explained these feelings in completely different ways. If you visited a physician, he wasn't going to mention stress hormones or neurotransmitters. Instead, he would probably spend a surprising amount of time examining your urine. Medieval doctors loved urine with the enthusiasm modern people reserve for smartphone reviews. The colour, the smell, the clarity. It was practically a medieval laboratory report. After a thoughtful inspection, he might nod wisely and announce that your humours were out of balance. Specifically, you probably had too much black bile, the humour believed to produce melancholy, fear, and persistent worry. You might think, that sounds completely made up. And you'd be right. But remember, people 800 years from now may look at some of our wellness trends with exactly the same expression. The important thing is that medieval physicians genuinely believed they understood what was happening inside your body. They weren't trying to trick anyone. They were working with the best medical knowledge available to them, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman scholars. Their explanations were wrong by modern standards, but their observations were often surprisingly accurate. They noticed that some people worried constantly, while others stayed calm. They noticed sleepless nights, trembling hands, racing hearts, loss of appetite, sadness, irritability, and minds that simply refused to slow down. In other words, they were describing anxiety without having a word for it. Life itself gave them plenty of reasons to feel that way. Every season came with uncertainty. A late frost could destroy months of work. One infected cut from chopping firewood could become life-threatening. News travelled slowly, but bad news somehow managed to arrive exactly on time. If war wasn't nearby, famine might be. If famine wasn't nearby, disease often volunteered to fill the schedule. You didn't make long-term retirement plans because, statistically speaking, next Tuesday was ambitious enough. Religion also shaped the way you understood these emotions. If you were a monk, periods of overwhelming worry might be described as spiritual temptation. Monastic writers often spoke about restless thoughts invading the mind during prayer. Some described an almost constant feeling of heaviness, distraction, and fear. They believed the soul needed discipline just as much as the body needed food. Interestingly, they didn't simply tell people to stop worrying. Humanity has apparently been receiving that spectacularly unhelpful advice for centuries, and it has never worked particularly well. Instead, medieval thinkers searched for solutions. Some recommended herbal remedies. Others encouraged prayer, music, manual labour, conversation, regular routines, or long walks to sacred places. Many believed that keeping both body and mind occupied was one of the best defences against endless worrying. And here's the surprising part. A number of those remedies still sound remarkably sensible today. Others involved bloodletting. History, as always, is a game of mixed results. As we journey through the medieval world, you'll discover that beneath the strange theories, mysterious herbs, and occasionally alarming medical practices were people who wanted exactly what you want after a long, stressful day. For their heart to slow down, for their thoughts to become quiet, and for one blessed night. To simply get some sleep without wondering whether the chickens sounded slightly too quiet outside. Because in the Middle Ages that was either nothing at all, or the beginning of a very interesting morning. If you wanted to understand medieval medicine, you first had to accept one very important fact. Your body was apparently a soup. Not a delicious soup, unfortunately. More of a complicated biological stew made up of 4 mysterious liquids called the humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. According to nearly every educated physician in medieval Europe, your entire personality, health, emotions, and probably your chances of having a pleasant Tuesday depended on keeping these 4 fluids in perfect balance. Simple, except no one could actually see 3 of them. The theory had been inherited from the physicians of ancient Greece, particularly the works of Hippocrates and later expanded by Galen. By the Middle Ages, doctors treated it less as a theory and more as an instruction manual for the human body. If something felt wrong, one of the humours had almost certainly decided to misbehave. And when it came to anxiety, fear, or constant worrying, the usual suspect was black bile. Black bile was associated with melancholy, a condition that covered an enormous range of emotions. It could mean sadness, nervousness, hopelessness, excessive fear, or simply feeling weighed down by life. If you constantly expected the worst, struggled to sleep, or couldn't stop imagining disasters, your physician might confidently explain that your body had become overloaded with this troublesome humour. Was there any scientific evidence? Absolutely not. Was everyone convinced? Almost everyone. The interesting part is that medieval doctors weren't ignoring their patients. Quite the opposite. They spent long periods asking questions about sleep, appetite, digestion, dreams, mood, work habits, and daily routines. They noticed patterns. They simply explained those patterns using the medical language available to them. Imagine sitting across from your physician. You explain that you've been lying awake every night imagining that your roof will collapse, your crops will fail, your horse looks suspiciously unhappy, and your cousin's cough somehow feels personally threatening. The doctor strokes his beard thoughtfully. A long pause follows. I believe you have too much black bile. You breathe a sigh of relief. Not because you've been cured, because at least it wasn't demons this time. Once the diagnosis had been made, treatment could begin. Physicians believed black bile could be reduced through careful diet, gentle exercise, warm baths, pleasant conversation, cheerful surroundings, fresh air, and a variety of herbal medicines. These recommendations sound surprisingly reasonable. Then came the less reassuring options. Some doctors prescribed purging the body with laxatives. Others recommended inducing vomiting. And of course there was bloodletting, medieval medicine's favourite answer to almost everything. Headache, bloodletting. Fever, bloodletting. Feeling anxious. Why not remove some blood and see how everyone feels afterward? If your only problem was worrying too much, losing a generous amount of blood seems like an excellent way to introduce several exciting new problems. Yet hidden beneath the flawed science was a surprisingly compassionate idea. Medieval physicians believed emotional suffering wasn't a personal failure. They believed it had a physical cause. Something inside the body had become unbalanced, and with patience, care, and treatment, balance might be restored. They were wrong about black bile, but they were absolutely right about one thing. People who struggle with constant fear deserve help rather than blame. A lesson that, unlike the humours themselves, has aged remarkably well. So you've officially been diagnosed with an excess of black bile. Congratulations. You still feel terrible, but now your misery has a name, which is always a comforting start. The physician closes his leather-bound medical book with an air of complete confidence. This is reassuring because he has absolutely no laboratory tests, no blood pressure cuff, no stethoscope, and certainly no MRI machine. His most advanced diagnostic equipment is his own experience, several centuries of inherited medical theory, and a willingness to look at your urine for an amount of time that modern society would consider deeply unsettling. Now comes the treatment. Contrary to popular belief, medieval doctors didn't immediately reach for the sharpest knife they owned. Good physicians usually started with the gentler options. They believed your daily habits shaped both your physical and emotional health, so changing your routine was often the first prescription. You might be told to sleep longer, eat lighter meals, avoid drinking too much ale, spend time walking outdoors, avoid becoming excessively angry, and perhaps most importantly, stop worrying so much. All excellent advice, except for the last one, which has probably never cured anyone in the entire history of humanity. Diet was considered especially important. Foods were believed to possess their own qualities. Some were hot, others cold. Some were moist, others dry. Since black bile was considered cold and dry, physicians tried to counter it with foods they believed had warmer, gentler properties. Instead of heavily salted meat every day, they recommended fresh vegetables when available, mild cheeses, eggs, poultry, fish, and warm broths. Honey was often preferred over excessive amounts of strong spices, and fresh fruit appeared whenever the season allowed. In other words, medieval doctors accidentally stumbled onto the revolutionary concept that living entirely on processed food and questionable beverages might not be ideal. Unfortunately, winter often had other plans. Exercise also appeared surprisingly often in medical advice. Not exhausting labour, that was something peasants were already receiving in generous quantities, but moderate walking, riding, gardening, or gentle movement. Physicians believed the body should stay active without becoming overheated or exhausted. Of course, telling a medieval farmer to exercise more was a bit like telling a fish to spend additional time in water. Bathing was another recommendation, although perhaps not as frequently as modern audiences imagine. Warm baths were thought to relax both muscles and the mind. Wealthier patients sometimes visited bathhouses where warm water, steam, massage, and conversation combined into something remarkably close to what we'd now call a wellness retreat. The only major difference was that nobody was charging extra for mindfulness. Sleep received special attention as well. Doctors advised patients to avoid going to bed immediately after large meals, to keep sleeping spaces reasonably comfortable, and to maintain regular sleeping habits whenever possible. They believed poor sleep didn't simply follow emotional distress, it could also make it much worse. That observation has survived the centuries rather well. Then came the medicines. Herbal mixtures were prepared with remarkable care. Some were brewed into teas, others became syrups, powders, oils, or wines infused with medicinal plants. Physicians mixed ingredients according to generations of tradition, convinced that nature had provided a remedy for nearly every illness if one simply knew where to look. Sometimes those remedies genuinely helped, and sometimes, after trying every gentle treatment available, the physician would quietly glance toward the cabinet where the bloodletting tools were waiting. Because no matter how promising the herbs had seemed, there was always Plan B. Unfortunately for the patient, Plan B usually involved losing a noticeable amount of Plan A. If there was one place in medieval Europe where your chances of finding a calm atmosphere were dramatically higher than average, it was a monastery. For one thing, nobody was trying to sell you anything. For another, the loudest argument of the day was usually about whether Brother Thomas had once again fallen asleep during morning prayers. Monasteries were far more than places of worship. They were hospitals, libraries, schools, pharmacies, and botanical gardens rolled into one. While kingdoms rose and fell outside their stone walls, monks quietly spent centuries collecting knowledge about plants that could ease pain, reduce fever, settle stomachs, and perhaps even soothe an anxious mind. The monastery garden wasn't planted at random. Every herb had a purpose. Lavender filled the air with its gentle fragrance. Lemon balm was valued for lifting heavy spirits. Chamomile soothed digestion and encouraged restful sleep. Sage appeared in countless remedies, while rosemary was believed to strengthen both memory and the mind. If modern supermarkets had an herbal tea aisle, medieval monasteries practically invented the concept. The monks observed nature carefully. They recorded which plants seemed helpful, which caused problems, and which should absolutely not be confused with their remarkably poisonous cousins. Admittedly, mistakes still happened from time to time, but medical progress has always involved a certain amount of learning what not to eat. Many remedies began with something wonderfully simple. Fresh herbs were gathered in the early morning after the dew had disappeared. They were dried carefully inside airy rooms or hung from wooden beams. Later, they would be crushed with mortars and pestles before being mixed into teas, ointments, oils, or medicinal wines. There was nothing rushed about the process. Even preparing the medicine required patience. That patience may have been part of the treatment itself. Life inside a monastery followed an almost perfectly predictable rhythm. Bells rang throughout the day. Meals happened at fixed hours. Work alternated with prayer. Gardens demanded quiet attention rather than frantic speed. Every activity gently reminded you that not every moment required urgency. Considering that modern people sometimes describe replying to 3 emails as absolute chaos, there may be something to learn from that pace. The monks also believed that caring for the soul helped care for the body. Working in the gardens became a form of quiet reflection. Pulling weeds, watering herbs, trimming plants, and harvesting flowers occupied both the hands and the mind. When your attention rested on the rosemary in front of you, it became much harder to imagine the 57 disasters your imagination had carefully scheduled for next week. Interestingly, modern research often points towards similar conclusions. Gardening, spending time among plants, breathing fresh air, and slowing daily routines can genuinely reduce stress for many people. The monks would probably smile at that. They might not understand brain chemistry or cortisol levels, but they would likely nod and say, "Yes, we've been tending gardens for several hundred years. We thought you might eventually notice." Not every medieval cure survived the centuries, but the simple idea that a peaceful garden can calm a restless mind has proven remarkably difficult to improve upon. If you could travel back to the Middle Ages and ask someone the secret to feeling calmer, they probably wouldn't tell you to live in the moment, mostly because they'd have absolutely no idea what you meant. They were too busy living according to bells, in monasteries, cathedral towns, castles, and even many villages. Life followed rhythms that barely changed from one day to the next. Bells announced when to wake, when to pray, when to work, when to eat, and when to sleep. You rarely needed to ask what came next. The answer was almost always, whatever we did yesterday. It doesn't sound particularly exciting, and that was precisely the point. Routine was comforting because it reduced uncertainty. In a world where harvests failed, kings started wars, diseases arrived without invitation, and winters occasionally behaved like they had personal grudges against humanity, having at least part of your day remain predictable was surprisingly valuable. You woke at roughly the same time. You ate at roughly the same time. You worked until the light faded. Tomorrow looked remarkably similar. Modern people often describe routine as boring. Medieval people would have described it as a luxury. Even outside monasteries, daily life followed dependable patterns. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn. Blacksmiths opened their forges with the morning light. Farmers worked according to the seasons rather than the clock. Housewives prepared meals, fetched water, spun wool, and cared for children in rhythms repeated almost every day. There were certainly surprises. Unfortunately, they usually involved invading armies. The repetition itself served an important purpose. When your body knows what comes next, your mind has fewer decisions to make. Medieval people never explained it in those words, but they clearly noticed that disorder often created emotional distress, while order brought stability. Monks took this principle even further. Their lives were carefully organised according to the rule of St. Benedict, a guide that governed nearly every part of daily existence. Hours were divided between prayer, reading, manual labour, meals, rest, and silence. Nothing was left entirely to chance. At first glance, it sounds incredibly restrictive. At second glance, it also sounds wonderfully peaceful. Imagine never wondering whether you should answer emails after dinner, because emails wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. The rule wasn't designed to eliminate freedom. It was designed to eliminate chaos. The monks believed an undisciplined life encouraged restless thoughts. If the body wandered aimlessly, the mind often wandered with it. But when each hour had a purpose, anxious thinking had less room to spread. Even ordinary work became calming. Copying manuscripts required enormous concentration. Weaving cloth demanded steady hands. Carving wood, tending animals, repairing tools, baking bread. These weren't simply jobs. They kept the mind occupied in useful ways. Anyone who has ever felt strangely relaxed after cooking a meal, planting flowers, or repairing something around the house has experienced a small piece of that medieval wisdom. They may not have understood neuroscience, but they understood attention. A busy mind isn't always an anxious mind. Sometimes it's simply looking for something worthwhile to do. And while medieval life was filled with hardships that none of us would volunteer to experience, its steady rhythm offered something that many people today quietly miss. The reassuring feeling that not every hour needed to be different, productive, optimized, or life-changing. Sometimes, Tuesday was simply Tuesday. And honestly, that sounds rather relaxing. Picture yourself walking into a medieval church after a particularly difficult week. The harvest has been disappointing. Your back hurts. Your roof has developed what builders politely call character. And your neighbour has once again informed everyone that the strange cloud yesterday was almost certainly a sign of something catastrophic. He's been saying this every week for 15 years. Inside the church, however, everything changes. The thick stone walls soften the noise from outside. Candles flicker gently in the dim light. The air is cool, carrying the scent of beeswax and incense. Conversations become whispers, then disappear altogether. For perhaps the first time all day, nobody is asking anything from you. Whether rich or poor, noble or peasant, the church offered something increasingly rare in any century: quiet. Medieval people believed that anxiety was not only a problem of the body, but also of the soul. A troubled mind could be comforted through prayer, reflection, confession, and moments of deliberate stillness. While their explanation was spiritual rather than psychological, many of the practices themselves would feel surprisingly familiar today. Take repetitive prayer, for example. A monk might slowly recite the Psalms. An ordinary villager might repeat the Lord's Prayer several times while kneeling. Pilgrims often whispered the same words mile after mile along dusty roads. To modern ears, it sounds purely religious. But think about what was actually happening. Your breathing slows. Your attention settles onto familiar words. Your thoughts stop jumping wildly between yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's worries. Instead, your mind follows a single, steady rhythm. Today, we'd probably call that focused attention. The medieval church simply called it prayer. Monks became particularly skilled at creating lives built around these peaceful pauses. Several times each day, bells interrupted work and reminded everyone to stop, breathe, and gather together. Whether copying manuscripts, tending gardens, or preparing meals, every task paused for a few moments of reflection. Imagine your smartphone interrupting your day by saying, "Please stop working for 10 minutes and sit quietly." It would probably be the first notification you didn't immediately resent. Silence itself was considered valuable. Certain monastic communities observed long periods without conversation. This wasn't because they disliked each other. In fact, they often worked closely together. They believed constant talking scattered the mind, while silence helped gather it back together. Considering how many people today fall asleep listening to podcasts because their own thoughts refuse to quiet down, perhaps the monks were onto something. Confession also played an unexpected role. Carrying guilt, fear, or private worries alone was considered unhealthy. Speaking honestly to a trusted priest gave people an opportunity to release burdens they had carried for weeks, months, or even years. No prescriptions, no complicated medical equipment. Just another human being willing to listen. Perhaps the greatest comfort religion offered wasn't the promise that life would become easier. It rarely did. Harvests still failed. Loved ones still died. Winter still arrived with remarkable consistency. Instead, faith gave suffering a framework. It suggested that fear did not have to be faced alone, that uncertainty had meaning, and that even during life's darkest moments, there was still hope waiting beyond them. For countless medieval people, that hope became one of the strongest medicines they ever received. Not because it removed every anxious thought, but because it reminded them that anxious thoughts didn't have to have the final word. If your anxiety became too heavy to carry, medieval Europe offered a rather unusual prescription. Walk, not around the block. Not for 10,000 steps, more like 200 miles, possibly 400, maybe even across an entire continent. Imagine you're having an awful day. The roof is leaking, your wheat isn't growing. Your goat has escaped for the 3rd time this month. At this point, the goat is no longer escaping. It simply has a better social life than you. Now imagine trying to deal with all of that completely alone. For most medieval people, that wasn't really an option. Life in the Middle Ages was incredibly difficult, but it was also remarkably communal. Whether you lived in a village, a market town, or inside monastery walls, you were almost constantly surrounded by other people. Privacy was scarce. Personal space was practically a myth. If you wanted 5 minutes completely to yourself, your best chance was probably walking into the woods, and even then there was a fair chance someone would ask why you weren't chopping firewood. While modern life often celebrates independence, medieval society depended on cooperation. You couldn't harvest an entire field by yourself. You couldn't build a house alone. You couldn't defend your village alone. And you certainly couldn't move a wagon out of the mud by delivering an inspiring motivational speech. You needed people. That constant interaction had an unexpected effect on emotional health. When something terrible happened, the whole village usually knew within hours. That might sound exhausting if you've ever had a nosy neighbour, but it also meant you rarely carried heavy burdens entirely by yourself. If your barn burned down, neighbours helped rebuild it. If someone became ill, meals appeared at the family's door. If a husband died, relatives and neighbours often stepped in to help with the harvest, not because they were exceptionally generous, because next year they might need exactly the same help. Medieval villages understood something simple. Today, it was your problem. Tomorrow, it might be mine. Guilds worked in much the same way. Blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, masons, weavers, and countless other craftsmen belonged to organisations that offered more than professional training. Guilds supported members during illness, helped widows, paid for funerals, and provided financial assistance when times became difficult. In other words, medieval people had support networks long before anyone invented the phrase. Conversation itself was often considered healing, not formal therapy, of course, more like spending an evening sitting around the fire after work, while everyone complained about the weather. Remarkably, this tradition has survived almost unchanged. The weather continues to receive terrible reviews. Stories also played an important role. Families gathered after sunset to tell tales of saints, heroes, miracles, local legends, and humorous mishaps. Laughter wasn't viewed as the opposite of seriousness. It was often a welcome relief from it. Even monasteries, despite their discipline, weren't joyless places. Medieval writings contain surprisingly playful stories about absent-minded monks, over-eager novices, and brothers who occasionally discovered that fasting became much easier immediately after someone accidentally left fresh bread unattended. Accidentally, of course. Looking back, medieval Europe was filled with dangers that would make most of us profoundly uncomfortable. But one thing many people possessed in abundance was community. They shared work, they shared meals, they shared grief, they shared celebrations, and perhaps most importantly, they shared worry. Because anxiety grows surprisingly well in isolation. It often becomes much smaller once another person quietly says, "Come, sit down. Tell me what's troubling you." If you asked a medieval physician to name the single most important cure for an anxious mind, there is a very good chance he would answer with one simple word: sleep. Not because it solved every problem. Your taxes would still be waiting in the morning. Your roof would still leak. And your rooster would still believe that 4 o'clock was a perfectly reasonable time for everyone else to start their day. But sleep gave both body and mind a chance to recover. Medieval doctors were fascinated by sleep. They believed that during the night the body repaired itself, digestion settled, the humours returned toward balance, and the mind recovered from the worries accumulated during the day. A restless night, on the other hand, could leave a person emotionally fragile long before breakfast. That observation has aged remarkably well. They even offered advice for getting better sleep. Don't eat enormous meals immediately before bed. Avoid excessive drinking. Keep the sleeping room reasonably warm. Try not to go to bed immediately after becoming angry or distressed. These recommendations sound surprisingly modern. The explanations behind them, somewhat less so. Physicians believed that food continued cooking inside the stomach throughout the night. If you ate too much, Strange vapours supposedly rose toward the brain, disturbing both sleep and dreams. Scientifically questionable, but anyone who has gone to bed immediately after an enormous holiday dinner knows that sleeping peacefully becomes optimistic. Dreams fascinated medieval people as well. Some believed dreams reflected physical health. Others believed they carried messages from God. Still others thought disturbing dreams simply meant your digestion had become confused. Imagine waking after dreaming that dragons had stolen your house. Today, someone might recommend drinking less coffee. In the Middle Ages, someone might recommend eating less cheese. History occasionally takes unexpected turns. The bedroom itself mattered. Most ordinary people slept on straw mattresses stuffed into simple wooden frames. Wealthier families enjoyed feather beds, wool blankets, and curtains that helped keep warmth inside. Regardless of social class, everyone understood that a warm, dry place to sleep was worth protecting. Sharing beds was also incredibly common. Families slept together. Servants shared rooms. Travellers often found themselves sleeping beside complete strangers at inns. Privacy was considered a luxury. Hopefully, your roommate wasn't the sort of person who snored loudly enough to frighten nearby livestock. Although medieval records strongly suggest such individuals have existed throughout human history. Interestingly, sleep itself often happened in two parts. Many historians believe that people commonly experienced what is now called segmented sleep. After several hours, they naturally woke during the middle of the night. Rather than panicking because they were awake at 2 a.m, they accepted it as perfectly normal. Some prayed, some reflected quietly. Some spoke softly with family members. Others simply sat beside the fire until they became sleepy again before returning to bed for a second period of rest. No one reached for a phone, mainly because the printing press hadn't even been invented yet, and social media was still several inconvenient centuries away. Perhaps the greatest lesson medieval people offer is this. They didn't expect sleep to be perfect every night. They accepted that wakefulness sometimes happened. And instead of turning those quiet hours into another reason to worry, many simply treated them as a peaceful pause before sleep returned on its own. Sometimes, the best cure for an anxious mind wasn't forcing yourself to sleep. It was trusting that, eventually, sleep would come looking for you. Imagine you've reached your limit. The market is louder than usual. Someone is arguing over the price of chickens. Someone else is arguing because the chickens have wandered into his cabbages. The blacksmith has been hammering iron since sunrise. Children are chasing each other through the street. A dog is barking. Another dog has decided this is an excellent opportunity to join in. If medieval people had possessed noise-cancelling headphones, they would probably have become the greatest invention since bread. Instead, many simply walked away. Long before anyone coined the phrase, "go touch grass," medieval people were already doing exactly that. Physicians often recommended fresh air as part of recovering from melancholy and emotional exhaustion. They believed stale, crowded air, especially in busy towns, could disturb the body's natural balance, while clean country air restored it. Their explanation wasn't scientifically perfect, but their instincts were surprisingly good. After all, a quiet meadow has a remarkable habit of minding its own business. Unlike your neighbours, walking through forests, fields, riversides, or monastery gardens gave people something they rarely found inside towns. Space. Your thoughts could finally spread out, instead of bouncing between narrow streets and crowded houses. The countryside also moved at a different pace. Trees didn't hurry. Streams didn't panic. Birds had absolutely no interest in your unpaid taxes. Nature carried on exactly as it had yesterday. There was comfort in that. Medieval writers frequently described gardens as places of healing. Monasteries carefully designed enclosed gardens filled with herbs, flowers, fruit trees, and shaded paths. These spaces weren't simply practical, they were intentionally peaceful. You could sit beneath an apple tree listening to bees instead of merchants. Honestly, the bees were often easier to negotiate with. Even nobles escaped into nature. Castles might appear magnificent from the outside, but they were crowded, noisy, smoky places filled with servants, soldiers, visitors, and enough political intrigue to make family dinners feel wonderfully uncomplicated. Many aristocrats found relief by riding through forests, hunting, fishing, or simply walking across their estates. While hunting was certainly more exciting than bird-watching, both activities shared something important. They demanded complete attention. It's surprisingly difficult to obsess over tomorrow's problems while trying not to fall off a horse. Peasants experienced something similar during ordinary work. Gathering herbs, watching sheep, cutting hay, collecting firewood. These tasks required steady focus, without demanding endless worrying. The body stayed busy while the mind gradually became quieter. Today, we might describe this as being present in the moment. A medieval farmer would probably just shrug. I'm watching sheep. Fair enough. Perhaps the greatest gift nature offered wasn't that it solved life's problems. It didn't. The harvest could still fail. Winter still arrived. Kings still declared wars with impressive confidence and questionable timing. But the forest never asked you to predict the future. The river never reminded you of yesterday's mistakes. The wind carried no expectations. For a little while, surrounded by trees older than anyone could remember, you were simply another human being sharing the landscape. And sometimes, that was enough to remind even the most anxious traveller that the world was far larger than the worries they carried inside their own head. Imagine waking up with your heart pounding for the 5th night in a row. You feel exhausted. Your thoughts won't slow down. Nothing terrible has happened, yet your mind insists on preparing for absolutely everything anyway. Today you might recognize these as symptoms of anxiety. In the Middle Ages, the explanation could be far more complicated. Medicine wasn't the only lens through which people understood emotional suffering. Religion shaped nearly every part of daily life, and the invisible world often felt just as real as the visible one. Angels, demons, miracles, temptations, and divine intervention weren't considered fairy tales. They were part of everyday reality. If someone experienced overwhelming fear, disturbing thoughts, or emotional distress, many believed the struggle might also have a spiritual dimension. Fortunately, that didn't automatically mean people assumed the worst. In fact, many priests were surprisingly compassionate. Their first recommendation was often confession, prayer, rest, and guidance rather than dramatic accusations. They understood that grief, guilt, fear, and uncertainty could weigh heavily on the soul. Speaking openly about those burdens was considered healthy, even necessary. It's remarkable how often medieval advice began with simply talking to someone. Some ideas age surprisingly well, others not quite. For example, certain writers believed demons could exploit moments of despair, whispering fearful thoughts into vulnerable minds. This wasn't because they imagined people were crazy. Rather, they believed every human life involved a constant spiritual struggle between hope and despair. If you've ever had your brain remind you of an embarrassing moment from 8 years ago while you're trying to fall asleep, you may understand why they suspected outside interference. The timing certainly feels suspicious. Monks knew this battle especially well. One of the most famous challenges they described was something called acedia. It wasn't exactly laziness, although it was sometimes translated that way. Instead, it referred to a heavy feeling of restlessness, emptiness, discouragement, and emotional exhaustion. A monk suffering from acedia struggled to concentrate during prayer. Time seemed to move painfully slowly. Nothing felt meaningful anymore. He wanted to be anywhere except where he actually was. Considering how many people today stare out of office windows, wondering whether they should quit everything and open a bakery in the countryside, the feeling hasn't disappeared entirely. The monks developed practical ways to fight it. They encouraged steady work, regular prayer, conversation with experienced brothers, reading, gardening, keeping busy without becoming frantic. Notice a pattern? Almost every medieval solution involved gently bringing the wandering mind back to the present. Of course, not every community responded wisely. There were unfortunate cases where unusual behaviour or severe mental illness was misunderstood, leading to fear or suspicion instead of compassion. Those moments remind us that medieval society, like every society, struggled to distinguish between conditions it understood and those it did not. Yet for most ordinary people, the goal wasn't punishment, it was comfort. Whether the cause was believed to be black bile, temptation, grief, exhaustion, or simply the hardships of life, medieval people wanted relief from the same racing thoughts that trouble millions today. They may have disagreed about where anxiety came from, but they agreed on something far more important. No one should have to face it completely alone. By now you've probably noticed something unexpected. The Middle Ages had some genuinely thoughtful ideas about calming an anxious mind. They also had bloodletting. History rarely commits to a single direction. For every treatment that makes modern doctors instinctively reach for the emergency stop button, there was another that wouldn't look out of place in a modern wellness retreat. The medieval explanation might have involved black bile, planetary influences, or balancing mysterious bodily fluids, but the actual practice sometimes produced real benefits. Take walking, for example. Medieval physicians recommended regular walks, particularly in peaceful places with clean air. They believed gentle movement warmed the body, improved circulation, and restored balance. They didn't know about endorphins. They didn't know about serotonin. They simply noticed that people who spent every day sitting indoors tended to become, well, rather miserable. Not exactly groundbreaking today, but a remarkably solid observation for a society that thought comets occasionally had opinions. Herbal medicine also deserves more credit than it usually receives. Many monastery gardens grew chamomile, lavender, lemon balm, mint, sage, and rosemary. These herbs weren't magical cures, but several contain natural compounds that modern science has found can promote relaxation or aid sleep in some people. The monks, of course, would probably smile at this discovery. So, you're saying the tea works? Yes. And it only took you 800 years to agree with us. Fair enough. Then there was routine. Modern psychologists often recommend maintaining regular sleeping hours, eating meals at consistent times, and creating predictable daily habits during periods of stress. A medieval monk would simply call that Tuesday. His entire life followed a dependable rhythm: wake, pray, work, eat, read, sleep, repeat tomorrow. No productivity podcasts required. Community may have been the greatest medicine of all. Most medieval people couldn't disappear into complete isolation even if they wanted to. Families lived together. Villages worked together. Guilds supported their members. Monasteries functioned as tightly connected communities. Sometimes this meant everyone knew your business before you did. Less pleasantly, everyone really knew your business. But loneliness was often less common than it is today. Modern research repeatedly shows that supportive relationships help protect emotional well-being. The medieval villagers would likely respond, of course. They had been borrowing each other's ladders for generations. Even prayer and quiet reflection reveal surprising similarities to modern therapeutic techniques. Repeating familiar prayers slowed breathing. Silent meditation reduced mental noise. Singing with others created feelings of connection. Working with your hands focused attention away from endless worrying. None of these activities eliminated hardship. They simply made hardship easier to carry. The remarkable truth is that medieval people weren't searching for a miracle cure. They weren't expecting one herbal drink to erase every fear. Instead, they built lives filled with small habits that gently pulled the mind away from constant worry. Fresh air, good company, meaningful work, regular sleep, simple food, moments of silence. Not one of these sounds particularly dramatic. That's probably why they worked. Sometimes the most effective remedies aren't the spectacular ones. They're the ordinary habits you repeat every single day. The medieval physician would have called it restoring balance. Today, we might simply call it taking care of yourself. Different words, surprisingly similar wisdom. As our journey through medieval Europe comes to an end, you might expect the final lesson to be about some forgotten herb, a miracle monastery, or an ancient medical secret waiting to be rediscovered. It isn't. The greatest medieval cure for anxiety was never a single treatment. It was a way of living. Now, before you sell all your belongings and move into a stone monastery, there are a few medieval traditions you can safely leave behind. Bubonic plague, open sewers, and dentistry performed by the same man who trims your beard have not enjoyed particularly successful comebacks. But hidden beneath all of that was a surprisingly thoughtful understanding of human nature. Medieval people accepted something that modern society often struggles with. Life was uncertain. Tomorrow could bring a good harvest, or a terrible storm, a healthy child, or sudden illness, a peaceful season, or war. No amount of worrying could guarantee one outcome over the other. That didn't mean they simply gave up. Far from it. They worked. They prayed. They planted. They prepared as best they could, and after doing what they were able to do, they tried to leave the rest in God's hands. Whether or not you share their religious beliefs, there is something quietly powerful about recognizing the difference between what you can control and what you cannot. Your medieval neighbor couldn't stop winter from arriving. He could chop enough firewood. He couldn't prevent every illness. He could care for his family. He couldn't guarantee a successful harvest. He could sow the fields anyway. There is a certain peace in focusing on today's work instead of tomorrow's fears. Modern life often encourages the opposite. We worry about next week, next month, 5 years from now. Sometimes we become anxious about events that haven't happened, and may never happen. If medieval people had spent every day imagining every possible disaster, nothing would ever have been planted, repaired, baked, or built. Someone still had to milk the cow, even if they were convinced the world might end by Thursday. Perhaps that explains why routine mattered so much, why community mattered, why gardens mattered, why long walks, music, prayer, shared meals, meaningful work, and quiet evenings beside the fire appeared again and again throughout medieval life. None of these erased hardship. They simply reminded people that peace was often found in ordinary moments, rather than extraordinary ones. And perhaps that's the greatest surprise of all. For a society separated from us by hundreds of years, medieval people weren't really searching for a different kind of happiness. They wanted exactly what we want. A good night's sleep, people they could rely on, food on the table, purpose in their work, hope for tomorrow, and just enough quiet at the end of the day for the mind to finally stop rehearsing catastrophes that hadn't happened. History changes, kingdoms rise and disappear, medicine advances. Technology transforms the world. Yet the human heart remains remarkably familiar. 800 years ago, someone sat beside a fire hoping tomorrow would be a little less frightening. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is hoping for exactly the same thing. Perhaps that's the most comforting lesson the Middle Ages leave behind. Some worries are timeless, but so is humanity's ability to keep going, one ordinary day at a time. Every Viking family knew recipes that never appeared in books, never hung on walls, and certainly never came with precise measurements. There were no cookbooks sitting beside the hearth, no grandmother whispering, "Just add 2 teaspoons." Instead, recipes lived inside people. They passed from parent to child through years of watching, stirring, tasting, and occasionally burning something expensive. A Viking child probably learned to cook long before becoming an adult. By the age of 7 or 8, many were already helping gather herbs, grinding grain, carrying water, or turning roasting spits over the fire. Cooking was not considered a hobby. It was survival with better seasoning. Most Viking homes centered around a single long fire that burned day and night. The flames provided warmth during brutal Scandinavian winters, light during the dark evenings, and the only reliable way to prepare food. Above the fire hung iron cauldrons suspended from adjustable hooks. Families could raise or lower the pot depending on how fiercely the meal needed to boil. Unlike modern kitchens filled with timers and gadgets that beep every 30 seconds, Viking cooks judged everything by experience. They knew when porridge had thickened simply by how it moved inside the pot. They judged bread by its smell rather than by a clock. If something started smoking a little too enthusiastically, that was simply valuable feedback. The ingredients themselves were wonderfully ordinary. Barley formed the backbone of countless meals because it survived the harsh northern climate better than wheat. Oats and rye were equally important. Cabbage, onions, peas, beans, carrots, turnips, and leeks appeared throughout the year whenever they could be harvested or preserved. Fresh herbs added surprising flavour. Dill, thyme, angelica, wild garlic, juniper berries, and caraway all found their way into everyday dishes. Vikings may have gained a reputation for sailing across Europe with axes, but they also appreciated food that didn't taste entirely of boiled root vegetables. Milk from cows, sheep, and goats became butter, cheese, and fermented drinks. Fish arrived fresh from rivers and fjords. Meat usually appeared only on special occasions or after successful hunts, making every roast something worth remembering rather than expecting. Preserving these ingredients required constant effort. Families smoked fish above the fire, salted meat, fermented vegetables, dried herbs, and stored grains inside wooden chests that protected them from moisture and hungry mice, who, despite never contributing to the household, remained enthusiastic dinner guests. Every family developed small differences in these recipes. One household preferred extra juniper. Another added more onions. A grandmother insisted the stew needed another handful of herbs because her grandmother had done exactly the same. Nobody argued too much with traditions that had successfully kept generations alive through freezing winters. These humble recipes became something greater than food. They became family history, carrying memories from one generation to the next, one steaming bowl shared around the fire at a time. If there was one food every Viking family recognized instantly, it was bread. Not the soft, fluffy loaf sitting in a modern bakery window, promising clouds of buttered perfection. Viking bread was denser, darker, and considerably more determined. One loaf could accompany breakfast, lunch, dinner, and, if it became hard enough, probably serve as a defensive tool against particularly confident seagulls. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal, because grain was precious. Most Viking farms grew barley, rye, and oats rather than wheat, which struggled in the colder Scandinavian climate. A successful harvest meant security for the coming winter. A poor harvest meant everyone suddenly became very interested in how edible tree bark might actually be. Making bread began with grinding grain using heavy rotary querns. This was exhausting work that usually fell to the women of the household, although everyone helped when necessary. The upper stone had to be turned continuously, while grain trickled through a hole in the centre. Hour after hour, coarse flour slowly collected beneath the stones. That flour wasn't perfectly clean. Tiny fragments of stone often mixed into it, wearing down people's teeth over years of eating. Archaeologists regularly find Viking skeletons with surprisingly worn molars, thanks not to excessive sweets, but to generations of enthusiastic flour grinding. Your dentist would probably have developed a permanent look of concern. The flour was mixed with water, sometimes a little sour milk or buttermilk, and occasionally a pinch of salt if the family could spare it. Commercial yeast did not exist. So many loaves were unleavened or relied on naturally fermented dough saved from previous batches. Every household guarded its starter carefully, much like modern bakers who mysteriously refer to theirs by first names. Instead of deep ovens, many families baked flat rounds directly on heated stones or iron griddles placed over the fire. The thin shape allowed the bread to cook quickly and evenly. Larger farms sometimes built clay baking ovens, but these were expensive and far less common than the dependable hearth. Fresh bread rarely sat alone. It accompanied fish stew, soaked up rich broths, supported slices of smoked meat, or carried generous portions of soft cheese and butter. Even stale bread found new life when broken into soups or mixed into porridge. Waste was a luxury few Viking households could afford. Every family had its own version. Some mixed crushed peas into the dough for extra nourishment. Others added wild herbs or seeds like caraway to improve the flavour. During lean years, cooks stretched the flour with ground beans or even dried moss. The result might not have won any baking competitions, but it filled hungry stomachs and carried Viking families through long winters, proving that the simplest recipes often became the ones remembered for generations. While bread formed the backbone of the Viking diet, stew was its dependable companion. In many households, the family cauldron was rarely empty for long. Morning leftovers became the afternoon meal. The afternoon meal quietly evolved into supper. Tomorrow's ingredients joined yesterday's broth. If the pot had feelings, it probably wondered whether retirement was ever an option. The beauty of Viking stew lay in its flexibility. There was no single recipe, because the recipe changed with the seasons, the weather, the harvest, and whether someone had returned home carrying fish, venison, or absolutely nothing. Every meal reflected what nature had decided to provide that particular week. The process usually began with fresh water poured into a heavy iron or soapstone pot suspended above the central hearth. Into this went chopped onions, leeks, cabbage, carrots, peas, beans, and plenty of turnips. Turnips appeared so often that they were practically honorary members of the household. Barley was almost always added. Unlike modern soup that might contain only a handful of grains, Viking stews often relied on barley to transform a light broth into a filling meal, capable of sustaining people through long days of farming, woodworking, weaving, or rowing a ship against an uncooperative wind. When available, meat enriched the pot. Lamb, goat, beef, pork, or game animals like deer all found their place. Yet contrary to popular imagination, Vikings did not feast on roasted meat every evening. Livestock represented wealth. Killing an animal meant sacrificing future milk, wool, or breeding potential, so meat was often used sparingly, cut into small pieces that flavoured the entire stew rather than dominating it. Fish appeared far more frequently. Fresh cod, herring, trout, salmon or eel could all be simmered with vegetables. Along the Scandinavian coast, seafood often supplied the main source of protein for ordinary families, making fishing as important as farming. Flavour came from simple additions. Dill brightened the broth. Thyme added warmth. Juniper berries contributed a gentle pine-like note that paired surprisingly well with game meat. Wild garlic and angelica gave fresh aromas during spring and summer. Without imported spices, local herbs became the cook's greatest advantage. Meals were served in wooden bowls, with everyone gathering around the fire. Spoons carved from wood, horn or bone handled most of the work, while bread helped scoop up whatever remained. Conversation flowed as freely as the broth, with stories, family news, and plans for the next day's work shared between mouthfuls. Perhaps the greatest strength of Viking stew was that it wasted almost nothing. A handful of vegetables too small to serve alone, a strip of smoked fish, yesterday's barley, or scraps left from another meal, all found a purpose in the cauldron. It was practical, nourishing, and endlessly adaptable, a recipe passed through generations because it fed families not only on good days, but especially on difficult ones. If bread filled the stomach and stew warmed the body, dairy quietly held the Viking kitchen together. A family might celebrate a successful hunt only a few times each year, but milk arrived almost every day during the warmer months. Cows, goats, and sheep were not simply sources of meat. They were living pantries that kept producing food, without anyone needing to sharpen an axe. Fresh milk, however, came with one rather inconvenient problem. It spoiled quickly. Without refrigeration, a bucket of milk could turn sour before the day was over, especially during the short Scandinavian summer. Rather than fighting nature, Viking families worked with it. They became masters of fermentation, discovering that food transformed by helpful bacteria often lasted far longer than food left untouched. Fresh milk became sour milk, a drink that modern taste buds might find surprising, but Vikings considered perfectly refreshing. It also became skyr-like cultured dairy, thick and creamy enough to eat with a spoon. Although today's Icelandic skyr has evolved over centuries, its roots stretch back to these early Norse traditions of carefully fermenting milk. Butter was another household treasure. Women churned cream inside wooden containers until tiny droplets of fat joined together into solid golden clumps. It demanded patience and strong arms. The process could take a long time, particularly if the cream decided to be stubborn that day. Fresh butter tasted wonderful, but preserving it mattered even more. Vikings often salted butter heavily before storing it inside wooden tubs or barrels. Properly prepared, it could survive for months, providing valuable calories throughout the winter when fresh milk disappeared. Cheese offered an even greater reward. Soft cheeses could be eaten almost immediately, while harder varieties aged over time, becoming portable sources of protein for travellers, fishermen, and traders. A wheel of cheese survived journeys far better than a bucket of fresh milk, making it ideal for long voyages across the North Sea. Whey, the liquid left behind after cheesemaking, was never wasted either. Families drank it, cooked with it, or used it to preserve meat. Some cuts of lamb and beef were submerged in acidic whey, slowing spoilage while adding a distinctive tangy flavour. Modern refrigerators had nothing on a barrel full of carefully fermented liquid and generations of practical experience. Children often helped with these tasks from an early age. They learned which cows produce the richest milk, how long butter should be churned, and when cheese had matured enough to eat. These lessons passed naturally from parents to children without written instructions, becoming part of everyday life. To a Viking family, fermentation was not mysterious science, it was simply common sense. Every successful batch of butter, cheese, or cultured milk represented another week of food security. These recipes endured because they transformed something temporary into something lasting, proving that sometimes the greatest ingredient in any Viking kitchen was patience itself. If a Viking family lived anywhere near the sea, a river, or one of Scandinavia's countless lakes, fish appeared on the table so often that nobody considered it special. It was simply dinner. While later stories celebrated daring raids and glorious battles, most ordinary Vikings spent far more time untangling fishing nets than swinging swords. History may remember the warrior, but the fisherman quietly kept everyone alive. The waters surrounding Scandinavia were astonishingly generous. Cold northern seas teemed with cod, herring, mackerel, haddock, and flatfish. Rivers supplied salmon, trout, pike, perch, and eels. During the salmon runs, entire communities could preserve enough fish to help feed themselves through the coming winter. Fishing itself required skill rather than luck. Families used woven nets, bone or iron hooks, wicker traps, and long fishing lines weighted with carefully shaped stones. Along rocky shores, children often searched for shellfish, while adults checked traps set the previous evening. Everyone contributed, because fresh fish rarely waited patiently for convenient working hours. The simplest preparation involved cooking fish almost immediately after it was caught. Whole fish could be roasted on wooden spits beside the fire, or placed on flat stones above glowing embers. Larger catches often found their way into the household stew, where tender flakes mixed with barley, onions, leeks, and herbs to create filling meals that stretched surprisingly far. But fresh fish lasted only a short time, forcing Viking families to become experts at preservation. Salting was one solution, although salt itself could be expensive in some regions. More commonly, fish were hung above slow-burning fires inside smokehouses. The gentle smoke dried the flesh while protecting it from insects and spoilage, producing food that remained edible for months. Air drying also played a major role, especially with cod. Along windy northern coastlines, cleaned fish could be suspended on wooden racks where cold air gradually removed moisture. The finished product became incredibly hard, almost like wood. Before eating, families soaked or cooked it until it softened once again. It was hardly elegant dining, but it travelled exceptionally well. Herring occupied a special place in Viking kitchens because enormous schools could be caught all at once. A successful herring season meant barrels filled with preserved fish, providing dependable meals long after the boats had returned to shore. Even fish bones found a purpose. Rich broths were made by simmering heads and skeletons, while smaller bones sometimes became tools or were ground into fertilizer for fields. Waste remained the enemy of every household. These fishing traditions became family knowledge, passed from one generation to the next. Parents taught children where salmon gathered, when herring arrived, and how to judge changing tides. Long before written recipes existed, these lessons ensured that the waters surrounding Scandinavia continued feeding Viking families, one careful catch at a time. Most Viking meals were practical. Bread, stew, fish, dairy, and whatever vegetables happened to be in season filled the bowls day after day. But every family also knew recipes reserved for life's biggest moments: weddings, Yule celebrations, successful harvests, religious festivals, and victorious returns from long voyages, all called for dishes that appeared only a few times each year. These were the meals children remembered for the rest of their lives. Preparation often began several days in advance. Families slaughtered an animal they had carefully raised, knowing this was a significant decision. A healthy pig, sheep, or goat represented months of work, so no part would be wasted. Choosing to serve one at a feast meant declaring that the occasion truly mattered. Pork was especially popular during major celebrations. A whole joint might roast slowly over the hearth for hours, turned carefully on an iron spit until the outside developed a rich brown crust while the inside remained tender. Someone always had the important responsibility of watching the fire, although that responsibility conveniently became much more attractive once people noticed crispy pieces forming near the edges. Lamb and goat were equally common depending on the region. Wealthier families might serve beef, though cattle often remained more valuable alive because they produced milk and calves. Hunting also contributed to feast tables. Venison, wild boar, ducks, geese, and occasionally hare could all become the centerpiece if hunters had enjoyed recent success. The side dishes reflected the changing seasons. Fresh cabbage, peas, beans, onions, and turnips surrounded the meat, while bowls of thick barley porridge ensured that every guest left with a full stomach. Fresh bread appeared in generous quantities, often spread with creamy butter or accompanied by soft cheese. Wild berries added welcome colour. Bilberries, lingonberries, raspberries, and cloudberries might be served fresh during summer, or preserved into thick fruit mixtures for colder months. Honey sweetened these simple desserts whenever a household had enough to spare, turning ordinary berries into something that felt genuinely luxurious. Drinks flowed freely during celebrations. Ale brewed from barley accompanied nearly every feast, while mead made from fermented honey appeared on especially important occasions. Contrary to popular legend, Vikings did not spend every gathering trying to drink themselves unconscious. Toasts certainly mattered, and hospitality was taken seriously, but feasts also revolved around storytelling, music, poetry, games, and strengthening family ties. Children listened as older relatives repeated stories their own grandparents had once told around the very same fire. Recipes passed alongside those stories. One aunt explained exactly when to add the herbs to the roasting meat. A grandfather demonstrated how to carve the best pieces without wasting anything. Knowledge moved naturally between generations with every shared meal. For a Viking family, these recipes carried far more than flavour. They marked births, marriages, successful harvests, peaceful winters, and joyful reunions. Long after the feast ended and the last crumbs disappeared, the traditions themselves remained, ready to be served again when the next great celebration arrived. If you asked a Viking child what the best meal of the year was, they probably would not answer with smoked fish or barley porridge. They would remember the rare moments when someone brought out honey, fresh berries, or a basket of newly gathered hazelnuts. Sweet foods were uncommon enough that they never became ordinary. They were treats tied to summer, celebration, and good fortune. Unlike today, there was no sugar sitting in a wooden bowl on the table. Refined sugar would not reach Scandinavia until centuries later, and when it eventually did, it was so expensive that only the wealthiest households could afford it. Viking families relied almost entirely on one natural sweetener: honey. Beekeeping existed throughout much of the Viking world, although wild bee nests were equally valuable. Finding one hidden inside a hollow tree could feel like discovering buried treasure. Harvesting the honey, however, required courage, patience, and a willingness to negotiate with thousands of tiny insects who believed they already owned it. Every drop mattered. Honey-flavoured porridges, sweetened drinks, glazed roasted meats, and transformed simple berries into memorable desserts. It was also the essential ingredient for mead, although children were much more interested in the honey itself than the drink adults carefully brewed from it. Summer brought an abundance of wild fruit. Families wandered forests and hillsides collecting bilberries, raspberries, strawberries, blackberries, lingonberries, and cloudberries, depending on the region. Gathering berries became a family activity, with children often proving surprisingly useful because they spotted bushes adults walked straight past. Of course, children also developed the mysterious habit of eating nearly as many berries as they managed to place inside their baskets. This unofficial tasting process probably reduced the final harvest more than anyone admitted. Most berries were eaten fresh while they lasted. Others were gently cooked into thick fruit mixtures or dried for later use. During the darkest winter months, opening a container of preserved berries offered a welcome reminder that summer would eventually return, even if the snow outside strongly disagreed. Nuts also played an important role. Hazelnuts grew naturally across parts of Scandinavia and were collected every autumn. Rich in oils and nutrients, they could be stored for months and added to bread, porridge, or simply eaten by themselves. Apples, where they could be grown, were equally treasured and often dried into slices that lasted well beyond the harvest season. Even these simple foods became family traditions. Grandparents knew the best berry patches, parents remembered which trees produced the sweetest apples, and children gradually inherited those secrets. No written map marked these places. The knowledge travelled through conversation, shared walks, and repeated seasons. These recipes reminded every Viking family that happiness did not always come from extravagant feasts. Sometimes it arrived in a wooden bowl filled with fresh berries, a drizzle of golden honey, and the satisfaction of enjoying gifts that the forests themselves had quietly provided for generations. A Viking recipe was never simply a list of ingredients. It was a conversation between generations. There were no written instructions tucked away in a cupboard, no measurements scratched onto wooden boards, and certainly no one saying, "Bake at exactly 350 degrees." Even if someone had wanted to, they would first have needed to invent the oven dial. Instead, every recipe lived in memory. Children learned by watching. A little girl might spend years standing beside her mother or grandmother, carrying buckets of water, washing vegetables, feeding the fire, and stirring the family cauldron. A young boy might help his father clean fish, smoke meat, gather firewood, or collect herbs growing along woodland paths. Before long, both understood nearly every meal the household prepared. No one announced, "Today is your cooking lesson." Life itself was the lesson. A grandmother might hand a child a handful of dill and simply ask, "Does this smell right?" At first, the answer hardly mattered. The child was learning to recognize herbs by scent alone. After enough summers, there would be no hesitation. One smell would immediately separate dill from wild parsley, thyme from angelica, or edible plants from those best admired from a respectful distance. Cooking also taught patience. A stew could not be rushed because the vegetables needed time to soften. Butter refused to appear until the cream had been churned long enough. Bread demanded careful attention to the fire. Too much heat left the outside black, while the centre remained raw. Too little heat produced something with all the excitement of damp clay. Mistakes happened, of course. Perhaps someone added too much salt to the soup. Maybe the fish stayed over the smoke for an extra day and emerged with the texture of carved oak. Occasionally bread burned because someone became distracted by exciting news from a returning trading ship. Fortunately, hungry families were remarkably forgiving. Burnt bread was still bread. As children grew older, they took on greater responsibilities. When most people picture the Mongol Empire, they imagine endless cavalry charging across the grasslands, fearless archers galloping at impossible speeds, and generals planning their next conquest. Those images are certainly part of the story, but they leave out something just as important. The days when the horses slowed down, the bows were set aside, and thousands of people gathered not for war, but for celebration. These festivals were the glue that held together one of the largest empires in history. The Mongol Empire eventually stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the plains of Eastern Europe, covering thousands of miles. Messages could take weeks to travel between distant regions. Entire clans might spend months living apart while following their herds across the steppe. Without regular opportunities to gather, people could easily begin to think of themselves as separate communities instead of members of one greater natio, and that was where festivals came in. Throughout the year, especially during the warmer months, families packed up their felt-covered jers, loaded wagons with supplies, and travelled across the open grasslands toward agreed meeting places. From miles away, they could already see hundreds, then thousands, of white tents appearing on the horizon like a city that had grown overnight. For many people, this was the happiest time of the entire year. Children reunited with cousins they had not seen since the previous summer. Old friends embraced after months spent grazing animals in different regions. Merchants arrived with goods from distant lands, bringing silk from China, fine cloth from Central Asia, jewellery from Persia, and stories from places most listeners would never visit. Even rivals looked forward to these gatherings. Friendly competition replaced open conflict. Wrestling matches settled questions of strength without spilling blood. Horse races allowed young riders to earn respect. Archery contests demonstrated skill that might one day prove valuable in battle, but for now the only prize was honour and enthusiastic applause from the crowd. The atmosphere was surprisingly cheerful. Music drifted across the camps from morning until night. Fires burned outside nearly every ger as families prepared generous meals for visitors. Hospitality became almost sacred. A stranger arriving at the festival could often expect a warm bowl of food and a drink before anyone even asked his name. There was another reason these festivals mattered so deeply. They reminded every clan that they belonged to something much larger than themselves. Whether they came from the forests of Siberia, the deserts near the Gobi, or the rich grazing lands of Mongolia, they all shared the same traditions, the same respect for the steppe, and the same sense of identity. For the Mongols, a festival was never just a celebration. It was a yearly renewal of family, friendship, loyalty, and unity, strong enough to help bind together an empire unlike any the world had ever seen. As the festival drew closer, the Mongolian steppe slowly came alive. For weeks beforehand, families prepared for the journey. Leather saddlebags were repaired, wagons inspected, horses chosen, and food carefully packed. Women wrapped wheels of dried cheese, filled leather bags with fermented mare's milk, and loaded sacks of dried meat that could last the entire trip. Children, meanwhile, counted the days with growing excitement, knowing they would soon see relatives and friends they had not met since the previous gathering. For many, the journey itself became part of the celebration. Across the grasslands, long caravans began moving toward the same destination. Herds of sheep and goats drifted alongside ox-drawn carts carrying the felt walls and wooden frames of jers. Riders appeared on distant hills, sometimes travelling alone, sometimes in groups of dozens. From sunrise until dusk, the open plains filled with movement. Yet there was remarkably little confusion. Every clan knew roughly where to meet because these gathering places had often been used for generations. Then, almost overnight, an empty valley transformed into a bustling town. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of white jers covered the landscape in carefully arranged circles. Smoke curled from countless chimneys. Horses grazed nearby under the watchful eyes of children, and the sounds of conversation echoed across the open fields. To someone arriving for the first time, it must have seemed impossible that so many people could appear in such a remote place with almost no permanent buildings. Yet the Mongols were masters of creating cities that could disappear just as quickly as they had appeared. The first day was often filled with greetings. Families embraced after months apart, exchanging news of births, marriages, successful hunts, harsh winters, and healthy foals. Grandparents finally met grandchildren born since the previous festival. Young cousins immediately disappeared together, racing across the grass before the adults had even finished talking. Merchants also found eager customers. Traders from China unpacked bolts of fine silk, while Muslim merchants displayed colourful fabrics, spices, metal tools, and beautifully crafted jewellery. Local craftsmen offered saddles, bows, arrows, knives, and carved wooden goods. The festival became one of the greatest marketplaces in the empire, where goods travelled almost as freely as stories. Politics quietly blended into celebration as well. Clan leaders renewed friendships, settled disagreements, discussed grazing rights, and strengthened alliances over shared meals rather than battlefields. A conversation begun beside a cooking fire could prevent a conflict months later. As evening arrived, fires illuminated the sea of white tents. Music drifted through the cool air, while the smell of roasting meat spread across the camp. Laughter travelled farther than any messenger, reminding everyone why these journeys mattered. For a few precious days, the vast distances of the Mongol Empire seemed to disappear. Thousands of separate families became one enormous community, united not by conquest, but by tradition, hospitality, and the simple joy of gathering together once again. Once everyone had arrived and the greetings were over, the heart of the festival could finally begin. The crowds gathered around open fields that stretched for miles, leaving plenty of room for the events that every Mongol eagerly anticipated. These competitions were exciting, fiercely contested, and full of pride. Yet unlike battles on distant frontiers, the goal here was not to defeat an enemy. It was to honour skill, courage, and discipline, while reminding every clan that they belonged to the same people. The three greatest contests became known as the three manly games: wrestling, horse racing, and archery. Together, they celebrated the very abilities that had helped build the Mongol Empire. Wrestling always attracted enormous crowds. There were no weight classes, no time limits, and no second chances. A wrestler lost the moment any part of his body other than his feet touched the ground. Victory depended on balance, patience, strength, and reading an opponent's movements. Charging forward wildly usually ended with someone staring up at the sky much sooner than expected. The wrestlers entered the field wearing open-fronted jackets, tight shorts, boots, and colourful hats representing their home regions. Before each match, they performed the famous eagle dance, spreading their arms like great birds soaring across the endless steppe. It was both a display of confidence and a sign of respect for tradition. Then came the horse races. Unlike modern racetracks, Mongol races covered extraordinary distances. Depending on the horses' ages, races could stretch from 10 to nearly 20 miles across open grasslands. There were no carefully prepared lanes or fences. Riders simply followed the landscape itself. Perhaps the greatest surprise for modern audiences would be the jockeys. Most were children. Boys and girls as young as 5 or 6 often rode these races because their lighter weight allowed the horses to run faster. They grew up riding almost as soon as they could walk, developing remarkable confidence and balance. Watching hundreds of young riders gallop over the horizon was one of the festival's most breathtaking sights. Archery completed the trio. Competitors aimed at rows of small leather or woven targets placed at impressive distances. Accuracy mattered far more than speed. Every successful shot drew cheers from spectators, while experienced archers earned admiration that reached far beyond their own clans. Winning brought prestige, but the competitions were about more than individual glory. A skilled wrestler reflected honor upon his entire family. A victorious horse made its breeder proud. An exceptional archer inspired younger generations to practice harder. Success belonged not only to the champion, but to the entire community that had raised and supported them. When the contests ended, there were no conquered enemies or defeated armies. There were only stories to tell around the evening fires, new heroes to admire, and friendships strengthened through honest competition. The Mongols understood something many empires never learned. Sometimes the strongest bonds between people were forged not in war, but on a field where everyone played by the same rules. As the cheers from the wrestling matches faded and the last horses crossed the finish line, another kind of performance began to take centre stage. The sounds of the festival slowly changed. Instead of pounding hooves and shouting spectators, the air filled with singing, laughter, and the gentle melodies of stringed instruments. As the sun dipped lower over the endless grasslands, families gathered around fires while musicians and storytellers prepared to entertain crowds that might remain awake long into the night. For the Mongols, music was far more than amusement. It was history. Unlike many civilizations that recorded their past in libraries filled with books, the Mongols relied heavily on memory. Their greatest victories, famous ancestors, heroic warriors, and ancient legends lived inside songs and stories, passed from one generation to the next. A talented singer was not simply an entertainer, he was a living library with remarkably better acoustics. One of the most recognizable instruments at these festivals was the morin khur, or horsehead fiddle. Its carved wooden neck ended in the shape of a horse's head, reflecting the animal that stood at the very heart of Mongol life. Traditionally, its two strings were made using horsehair, producing a rich, haunting sound that seemed perfectly suited to the vast openness of the steppe. Even today, hearing its slow melodies while looking across the Mongolian plains feels strangely timeless. Storytellers often accompanied the music with epic tales that could last for hours. They recounted the deeds of legendary heroes, clever hunters, loyal companions, and wise khans. Many stories taught important lessons about courage, generosity, honesty, or respect for one's family. Children listened with wide eyes, while older listeners silently mouthed familiar lines they had heard since childhood. Some performers practiced throat singing, a remarkable technique that allowed one singer to produce multiple notes at the same time. The low, steady drone combined with higher whistle-like tones created a sound unlike almost anything else in the world. To travellers visiting from Europe or the Middle East, it must have seemed almost magical. To the Mongols, it simply sounded like home. Music also encouraged participation rather than quiet observation. Families clapped along with rhythms, joined familiar choruses, and occasionally stood to dance. Young people met one another during these gatherings. Friendships deepened, and future marriages often began with nothing more dramatic than two people sharing a song beside the evening fire. As darkness settled across the sea of white jers, the music continued drifting through the camp, carried by the cool night breeze. Long after the competitions had ended, these songs reminded everyone that the Mongol Empire was held together not only by powerful armies and skilled horsemen, but also by shared stories, familiar melodies, and traditions that every family recognized, no matter how far they had travelled to reach the festival. After a full day of racing horses, testing strength, and listening to music, one event remained that everyone anticipated with equal enthusiasm: the feast. As evening settled across the steppe, hundreds of cooking fires flickered into life. Thin columns of smoke rose into the sky while the smell of roasting meat drifted across the camp. You did not need an invitation to know where dinner was being prepared. Your nose would happily solve that mystery long before your eyes did. Hospitality was one of the greatest virtues in Mongol society. A guest was treated with enormous respect, whether he was a neighbouring herdsman, a distant relative, a travelling merchant, or even a foreign ambassador. Refusing to offer food would have reflected poorly on the host, while accepting the meal created a bond of trust between both parties. Around these festival tables, friendships often grew stronger than treaties. The centrepiece of nearly every feast was mutton. Sheep thrived on the grasslands, making them one of the empire's most valuable animals. Large cuts of meat were boiled in enormous iron cauldrons until they became tender enough to pull apart with little effort. Unlike many modern recipes, Mongol cooking relied on the natural flavour of the meat rather than heavy seasoning. Salt was used when available, but spices remained relatively rare across the steppe. Horse meat also appeared on special occasions, particularly during important celebrations. To outsiders, this sometimes seemed surprising, but the Mongols viewed horses with both deep affection and practical understanding. A trusted riding horse was rarely eaten, yet older animals or those raised specifically for food became part of ceremonial meals that honoured the importance of the herd itself. Alongside the meat came dairy products that every Mongol family recognised immediately. Fresh cheeses, dried curds known as arul, thick clotted cream, butter, and bowls of yogurt-like fermented milk covered low tables or woven mats spread across the ground. These foods had sustained nomadic families for generations and remained staples even during grand celebrations. No festival feast would have been complete without airag fermented mare's milk. Served in wooden bowls, it carried a slightly sour taste that often surprised foreign visitors. Some loved it immediately. Others politely smiled while silently wondering whether the horse had somehow become involved by accident. The Mongols, meanwhile, drank it with obvious enjoyment, offering bowl after bowl to honoured guests. Meals followed careful customs. The eldest guests were served first, and choice pieces of meat often went to respected elders or distinguished visitors. Younger family members watched closely, learning not only how food was prepared, but how generosity and respect were demonstrated through sharing it. As darkness spread across the festival grounds, conversation flowed as freely as the food. Stories of distant journeys mixed with laughter. Merchants discussed new trade routes. Children chased one another between the glowing jers, and strangers slowly became friends. These feasts did far more than satisfy hunger. They reminded every person gathered on the steppe that no matter how vast the empire became, it was still built upon the simple tradition of welcoming others, sharing what you had, and leaving no guest with an empty bowl. Not every contest at a Mongol festival was designed to create champions. Some existed for a much simpler reason. They made people laugh. After the great horse races, wrestling matches, and archery competitions had ended, the festival took on a more relaxed atmosphere. Families wandered between camps, children disappeared into groups of new friends, and smaller games sprang up wherever there was an open patch of grass. These activities may not have earned songs from travelling bards, but they played an equally important role in bringing people together. The youngest members of the community rarely stood on the sidelines. Children organised foot races across the steppe, practised riding ponies under the watchful eyes of parents, and held friendly archery contests using smaller bows made especially for them. By turning important skills into games, Mongol children learned almost without realising it. One day they were laughing during a race. A few years later, those same abilities helped them manage herds or ride across the empire with astonishing confidence. One of the most beloved traditional games involved ankle bones from sheep. Known today as shagai, the game used polished bones that landed in different positions, each representing an animal such as a horse, sheep, goat, or camel. Depending on the rules being played, competitors flicked the bones across the ground, aimed at specific targets, or relied on luck and careful strategy. The game was wonderfully portable. A handful of ankle bones fit easily into a small pouch, allowing children and adults to carry them almost anywhere. Around the evening fires, entire families might spend hours playing together, laughing over unexpected victories and spectacularly poor attempts at accuracy. It was proof that entertainment did not require elaborate equipment, just imagination and a steady hand. Strength contests were equally popular. Young men challenged one another to lift heavy stones, while others tested their endurance through riding demonstrations or displays of horsemanship. Instead of fighting with weapons, rivals competed to see who could stay mounted during difficult maneuvers or control spirited horses with the greatest skill. There were games of wit as well. Elders posed riddles, told clever stories with hidden meanings, or challenged listeners to finish familiar tales correctly. A quick mind earned just as much admiration as strong muscles. After all, surviving on the open steppe required intelligence every bit as much as physical strength. Perhaps the greatest benefit of these games was that they transformed rivalry into friendship. A young wrestler, who had lost earlier in the day, might spend the evening laughing beside the man who defeated him. Children from distant clans played together without caring whose family grazed horses hundreds of miles away. Merchants competed over trading bargains while sharing bowls of airag afterward. These moments mattered because they built trust. The Mongol Empire stretched farther than almost anyone could imagine, yet festivals reminded its people that they had far more in common than what separated them. A shared game, a burst of laughter, or a friendly contest could accomplish something even armies sometimes struggled to achieve, turning strangers into neighbours. Beneath the excitement of the races, the music and the feasting, every Mongol festival carried a quieter purpose. It was a chance to give thanks. The Mongols believed that life on the steppe depended upon forces far greater than any individual. A harsh winter could wipe out entire herds. A dry summer could leave the grass too thin to feed horses, sheep and goats. Success depended not only on hard work, but also on living in harmony with nature and showing respect to the spiritual world. At the centre of that belief stood Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Unlike many civilizations that worshipped inside grand temples or towering stone buildings, the Mongols found their sacred places in the open landscape itself. The endless sky above them was their greatest reminder of Tengri's presence. Looking upward across the boundless steppe, it was easy to understand why they believed heaven had no walls. Before many celebrations officially began, elders offered simple prayers. There were no elaborate ceremonies requiring dozens of priests. Instead, respected members of the community thanked Tengri for healthy families, strong horses, successful journeys, and peaceful seasons. They asked for continued protection over their people and their animals, knowing both depended on the same grasslands for survival. Offerings often accompanied these prayers. A small splash of airag, fermented mare's milk, might be sprinkled onto the ground before anyone drank from the bowl. It was a simple gesture, returning a portion of nature's gifts before enjoying the rest. To modern eyes it may seem symbolic, but to the Mongols it reflected genuine gratitude rather than empty ritual. Sacred mountains, rivers and unusual rock formations also held special meaning. Travellers sometimes stopped to add a stone to a growing cairn or tie strips of blue cloth to sacred sites, while offering silent prayers for safe journeys. These customs reminded people that certain places deserved respect, regardless of which clan happened to control the surrounding land. Ancestors were never forgotten during these gatherings. Stories of grandparents, great warriors, wise leaders, and beloved family members were shared around evening fires. Children who had never met these relatives still learned their names, their achievements, and the lessons they had left behind. In this way, every generation remained connected to those who came before. Even Genghis Khan encouraged respect for traditional beliefs throughout much of his reign. Although his empire included people following many different religions, the old customs of honouring Tengri and respecting the natural world remained deeply rooted among the Mongols themselves. Perhaps that balance explains why these festivals felt so complete. The day celebrated physical strength through wrestling, speed through horse racing, and skill through archery. The evening celebrated music, family, and food. And woven quietly through it all was gratitude for the sky above, the land below, the ancestors who had guided them, and the hope that future generations would gather beneath that same endless blue horizon, continuing traditions that had united the Mongol world for centuries. As the Mongol Empire expanded under Genghis Khan, the festivals grew larger than anyone could have imagined. What had once been gatherings of neighbouring clans became celebrations that drew people from every corner of an empire stretching across continents. Riders arrived after weeks on horseback. Merchants crossed deserts and mountain passes. Envoys spoke unfamiliar languages. Yet for a few remarkable days they all found themselves sharing the same grassland, the same food, and the same celebrations. These festivals became more than cultural traditions. They became instruments of empire. Genghis Khan understood something many rulers overlooked. An empire could not survive forever through military victories alone. Conquest created borders, but loyalty kept those borders together. Festivals gave people from distant regions the chance to meet face to face, rather than remain strangers connected only by taxes or military orders. Clan leaders gathered to renew old alliances and build new ones. Generals, who had spent months campaigning in different parts of the empire, exchanged experiences around the evening fires. Governors discussed trade routes, grazing lands, and local concerns. Decisions that might have required endless written messages could often begin with a shared meal and an honest conversation. Foreign visitors were equally fascinated. Merchants from Persia displayed fine carpets and silverwork. Chinese traders brought silk, porcelain, tea, and beautifully crafted goods that amazed many nomadic families. Artisans from Central Asia demonstrated skills unfamiliar to the Mongols, while travellers from distant kingdoms quietly observed the remarkable organisation of these enormous gatherings. The festivals became living marketplaces where ideas travelled alongside merchandise. When people hear the words, "the Great Wall of China," they usually imagine one enormous wall stretching endlessly across mountains, built all at once by a single emperor. It is one of history's most famous landmarks, but it also suffers from one of history's biggest misunderstandings. The Great Wall did not begin as one wall. It began as many. Centuries before China became a unified empire, the land was divided among powerful kingdoms that constantly competed for territory, influence, and survival. This was a dangerous age known as the Warring States period. Every ruler worried that the next attack might come not only from rival Chinese kingdoms to the south, but also from fast-moving nomadic horsemen riding out of the northern grasslands. Those northern frontiers were unlike anything farther south. Instead of rivers, forests, or mountain ranges forming natural borders, much of northern China opened onto vast steppes that seemed to stretch forever. For mounted warriors, these grasslands were perfect highways. A raiding party could appear with astonishing speed, seize livestock, burn villages, and disappear back into the open plains long before a large army had time to respond. The kingdoms needed a solution. Rather than building castles every few miles, they began constructing long defensive barriers along their most vulnerable frontiers. These early walls looked nothing like the towering stone fortifications tourists visit today. Most were built using earth, gravel, clay, reeds, and wooden frames. Workers packed layers of soil between wooden moulds, pounding each layer until it became incredibly hard. This technique, known today as rammed earth, produced walls that were surprisingly durable. Some sections, despite being more than 2,000 years old, still survive in the dry landscapes of northern China. Each kingdom built according to its own needs. The states of Qin, Zhao, Yan, and others constructed separate defensive lines, protecting different stretches of their borders. These walls rarely connected with one another because each ruler cared primarily about defending his own territory rather than creating a single national frontier. In many ways, they resembled neighbours building individual fences around their own farms instead of agreeing on one fence for the entire village. The walls also reflected a simple military reality. They were never expected to stop an invasion by themselves. A determined army could eventually cross almost any barrier. Instead, the walls slowed raiders, forced them toward guarded passes, and gave soldiers precious time to light signal fires, gather reinforcements, and prepare defences. Sometimes, the greatest value of a wall was not keeping enemies out, but making sure everyone knew they were coming. Long before the famous Great Wall took shape, these scattered fortifications were already protecting northern China. They formed the foundation of one of the greatest engineering projects in human history, proving that the world's most famous wall did not begin with an empire. It began with frightened kingdoms determined to survive. The scattered frontier walls built by rival kingdoms served their purpose for generations. Then everything changed. In the late 3rd century before Christ, one kingdom accomplished what had seemed impossible. The western state of Qin defeated every one of its rivals, ending centuries of warfare and creating China's first unified empire. Its ruler, Qin Shi Huang, declared himself the first emperor, determined to bind the newly conquered lands into a single nation. Unifying China, however, created an entirely new problem. The old walls no longer separated competing kingdoms. Those internal borders had become meaningless overnight. But beyond the empire's northern frontier, the danger had not disappeared. If anything, it had become greater. To the north lived the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of nomadic tribes whose horsemen could travel astonishing distances across the open steppe. They did not rely on cities, permanent farms, or roads. Their wealth moved with them in the form of horses, sheep, cattle, and families living in portable tents. That mobility made them incredibly difficult opponents. A Chinese army marching on foot often struggled to catch riders who could simply disappear into the endless grasslands. Even when victories were won, the nomads rarely stayed in one place long enough to be completely defeated. Fighting them sometimes felt like trying to catch the wind with a fishing net. Qin Shi Huang decided that defending the frontier required something larger than the scattered walls left behind by the old kingdoms. Rather than beginning from nothing, he ordered generals and engineers to repair, strengthen, and connect many of the existing northern fortifications. New sections were added where dangerous gaps existed, while abandoned walls that no longer served a purpose were simply ignored. The result was not one continuous wall stretching across China. Instead, it became a connected system of defensive barriers adapted to rivers, mountains, deserts, and valleys. Wherever the landscape itself offered protection, builders used it. Steep cliffs became natural extensions of the frontier, saving countless hours of construction. The empire preferred to let mountains do as much work as possible. Mountains, unlike labourers, never asked for a day off. Building this enormous defence required extraordinary effort. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, labourers, prisoners, and convicted criminals worked along the frontier. They hauled earth, stone, timber, and reeds across difficult terrain, often under harsh conditions. In remote regions, Supplies had to travel enormous distances before construction could even begin. A single basket of food reaching a worker might have passed through dozens of hands. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and often deadly. Yet the emperor viewed the project as essential. The frontier could no longer consist of isolated kingdoms protecting themselves. It now represented the northern edge of a single empire, and every section of wall symbolized that new unity. For Qin Shi Huang, the wall was never simply a construction project. It was a declaration that China had become one nation and that its northern frontier would be defended as one as well. Once the frontier wall began taking shape, another challenge quickly became obvious. A wall without people is simply a very long pile of earth. Someone had to patrol it, repair it, defend it, and survive on one of the most isolated frontiers in the ancient world. That responsibility fell to thousands of soldiers, engineers, farmers, officials, and their families, who spent years living where China's farmland met the endless northern steppe. Life there was rarely easy. Most frontier forts stood far from major cities. The nearest market might be several days away. Winters were bitterly cold, with winds sweeping unhindered across the grasslands. Summers could be dry and dusty, covering everything, from armour to cooking pots, in a fine layer of dirt. After enough weeks, even the bread probably developed opinions about the weather. The soldiers stationed along the wall followed demanding routines. At dawn, they inspected the surrounding countryside, looking for fresh hoofprints, distant dust clouds, or smoke that might signal approaching riders. Throughout the day, they repaired damaged sections of the wall, maintained gates, practiced archery, and cared for their horses. Even during peaceful periods, everyone remained alert because raids often came with very little warning. Many of these men were not professional soldiers for life. Some were farmers completing military service. Others were criminals sent to the frontier as punishment. A number volunteered, attracted by the promise of land or steady pay. Regardless of how they arrived, the frontier soon treated everyone equally. Cold winters showed little interest in a person's career choices. Supporting these garrisons required enormous organisation. Food had to reach isolated forts every month. Grain travelled in wagons whenever roads allowed. In rough country, supplies moved by pack animals or human porters carrying heavy loads across narrow mountain paths. A shortage of food could weaken an entire garrison long before any enemy appeared. To reduce that risk, many dynasties encouraged soldiers to become farmers as well. Fields were planted near forts wherever the land permitted. During peaceful months, troops cultivated wheat, millet, beans and vegetables while raising animals for meat and milk. These military farms supplied much of the food needed to keep the frontier functioning, reducing dependence on long and vulnerable supply lines. Families gradually formed communities around many of these outposts. Blacksmiths repaired weapons and horseshoes, carpenters built gates and watchtowers, merchants visited with cloth, salt, tea, and everyday necessities. Children were born knowing the wall not as a famous monument, but simply as part of the landscape outside their homes. For them, the frontier was ordinary. They watched signal fires burning on distant hills, listened to patrols returning through the gates at sunset, and grew up understanding that beyond the horizon lay a very different world. The Great Wall was not only built by workers, it was kept alive by generations of ordinary people who accepted the hardships of frontier life, so that the empire behind them could sleep a little more peacefully. Their names rarely appeared in history books, yet without them, even the strongest wall would have stood empty. If you stood on the Great Wall expecting to see a single defensive barrier stretching endlessly into the distance, you would be missing half the story. The wall was never just a wall. It was an entire military system. Imagine the frontier as a giant living network. Every tower, gate, fortress, mountain pass, and signal station worked together like parts of one enormous machine. If even one piece failed, the rest of the frontier became weaker. But when every part functioned as intended, news could travel across hundreds of miles with astonishing speed. The most recognizable features after the wall itself were the watchtowers, placed on hilltops, ridges, and mountain peaks. These towers gave soldiers an excellent view of the surrounding countryside. From their high positions, guards could spot riders long before they reached the frontier. Sometimes they noticed nothing more threatening than a wandering herd of deer. Other times they saw dust clouds on the horizon, the unmistakable sign that hundreds of horses were approaching. Once danger was confirmed, the real brilliance of the system came into play. Instead of sending a messenger galloping from fort to fort, soldiers lit beacon fires. During the day, thick columns of smoke climbed into the sky. At night, bright flames pierced the darkness. Different combinations of smoke, fire, drums, and signal flags could communicate valuable information. A small raiding party required one signal. A larger force demanded another. Nearby garrisons immediately understood both the warning and the scale of the threat. Under ideal conditions, these signals travelled with remarkable speed. A message could leap from one beacon tower to the next, across mountain ridges far faster than any rider could cover the same distance. News that might have taken days by horseback could sometimes reach distant commanders within hours. The gates built into the wall were equally important. These were not simply doors punched through the fortifications. They were heavily defended fortresses with thick walls, barracks, storage buildings, wells, and permanent garrisons. Famous passes like Juyong Pass and Shanhai Pass became bustling military towns where soldiers, merchants, officials, and travellers all crossed paths. Trade often flowed through these gates during peaceful times. Caravans carrying silk, tea, iron tools, horses, and countless other goods entered and left under careful supervision. The wall was designed to regulate movement as much as to stop it. The empire wanted to know who was entering, who was leaving, and what they were carrying. Roads connected these frontier outposts, allowing troops and supplies to move quickly wherever danger appeared. Granaries stored food, armories held spare weapons, and wells ensured that isolated forts could survive long periods without outside help. The genius of the Great Wall was never found in its height alone. Its true strength came from communication, preparation, and coordination. Every tower, every beacon, every guarded pass served a single purpose, ensuring that no threat could arrive unnoticed. In a world where a few hours could decide the fate of entire provinces, that warning system was often more valuable than the wall itself. The frontier defences built under Qin Shi Huang were impressive, but they did not solve China's northern problem forever. When the Qin dynasty collapsed only a few years after the first emperor's death, the wall remained, but the empire itself fell into chaos. A new dynasty eventually emerged from the turmoil, the Han, and its rulers inherited not only a vast kingdom, but also the difficult question every emperor would face. How do you defend a frontier that stretches for thousands of miles? At first, the Han emperors tried diplomacy. The Xiongnu Confederation remained powerful, and after several costly military defeats, early Han rulers accepted a policy known today as Heqin. Chinese princesses were married into Xiongnu ruling families, valuable gifts were exchanged, and annual shipments of silk, grain, and other luxury goods crossed the frontier in hopes of maintaining peace. It was an expensive arrangement. Some officials argued that these agreements simply encouraged further demands. Others believed buying peace was far less costly than fighting endless wars across the steppe. Neither side was entirely wrong. Eventually, the balance shifted. Under Emperor Wu of Han, the empire grew stronger, wealthier, and far more confident. Instead of relying mainly on diplomacy, the Han launched a series of major military campaigns deep into Xiongnu territory. Chinese cavalry rode farther north than ever before, challenging the nomads on their own grasslands instead of waiting behind defensive walls. The Great Wall did not become less important. In fact, it became part of a much larger frontier strategy. The Han repaired damaged sections, strengthened key fortifications, and constructed new defensive lines where necessary. But they also built military colonies beyond the wall itself. Soldiers settled with their families, cultivated farmland, raised livestock, and established permanent communities in regions that had once been dangerous borderlands. The frontier slowly moved outward. One of the Han dynasty's greatest achievements was securing the trade routes that later became known as the Silk Road. Merchants carrying silk, jade, spices, glassware, precious metals, and exotic animals now travelled through narrow corridors protected by forts and garrisons. Every caravan reaching Central Asia represented not only commercial success, but also the growing influence of the Han Empire. Beacon towers multiplied across deserts and mountain passes. Some stood in places so remote that their garrisons lived hundreds of miles from major cities. Archaeologists have discovered wooden documents, military orders, letters, and supply records preserved by the dry desert climate, offering remarkable glimpses into the daily lives of frontier soldiers who guarded these lonely outposts nearly 2,000 years ago. The Han emperors understood something the Qin had begun to realize. A wall alone could never defend an empire. It needed soldiers, settlements, diplomacy, trade, intelligence, and the willingness to adapt to changing threats. The Great Wall remained the backbone of the northern frontier, but under the Han, it became only one part of a far more sophisticated system, one that protected not just China's borders, but also the growing network of trade and culture connecting East and West. If the Great Wall was so long, so heavily guarded, and so carefully maintained, a simple question naturally follows. Why did nomadic armies keep appearing inside China? The answer is surprisingly straightforward. The wall was defending against opponents unlike any settled empire had faced before. To the north lived societies that built their entire way of life around mobility. The Xiongnu, followed centuries later by groups such as the Xianbei, Khitans, Jurchens, and eventually the Mongols, did not depend on permanent cities surrounded by farmland. Their homes could be packed onto wagons in a matter of hours. Their wealth grazed on four legs. Their roads were the open grasslands. Trying to predict where they would strike next was incredibly difficult. The Chinese army often moved with supply wagons, engineers, cooks, blacksmiths, and thousands of infantry. It advanced steadily, but rarely quickly. A nomadic raiding force was completely different. Mounted almost entirely on horseback, riders carried what they needed with them. Many warriors brought several horses, changing mounts during long journeys to keep their animals fresh. While one horse rested, another continued the ride. This allowed them to travel astonishing distances in remarkably short periods. Imagine trying to catch someone who never had to stop for fuel while you were towing an entire village behind you. That was often the challenge facing Chinese commanders. The Great Wall helped, but it could not cover every mile perfectly. Mountains, deserts, deep valleys, and rivers created gaps that were difficult to patrol constantly. Some sections deteriorated during periods of political instability. Others were simply too remote to station large numbers of troops year-round. Even when the wall itself remained secure, clever opponents searched for weaknesses elsewhere. Some raids slipped through lightly defended mountain passes. Others bypassed sections of the frontier entirely, by taking unexpected routes. On occasion, local officials accepted bribes and quietly opened gates for invading forces. Human error has always been considerably easier to exploit than solid stone. Large invasions presented an even greater challenge. No defensive wall could permanently stop a determined army supplied with siege equipment, engineers, and enough time. A wall delayed attackers. It exhausted them. It forced them into predictable routes where defenders could concentrate their strength. But by itself, it could not guarantee victory. Chinese emperors understood this reality. That is why they invested not only in walls, but also in cavalry units capable of pursuing nomadic forces across the steppe. Diplomats negotiated alliances with rival tribes. Traders exchanged silk for horses. Intelligence networks gathered information about movements beyond the frontier long before battles began. In many ways, the Great Wall functioned like an early warning system, rather than an impenetrable barrier. Its greatest success was buying time. Time for signal fires to spread the alarm. Time for frontier garrisons to prepare. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Against some of the finest horsemen in history, those extra hours could mean the difference between a village caught completely by surprise and an empire ready to defend itself. That was the wall's true purpose, not to make invasion impossible, but to make it far more difficult and far more costly. For centuries after the Han Dynasty, China's northern frontier continued to change. Dynasties rose and fell. Some repaired the old walls, others abandoned them entirely. New kingdoms appeared, disappeared, and redrew the map again and again. At times the frontier moved hundreds of miles north. At other times, it retreated deep into China itself. Then came one of the greatest shocks in Chinese history. In the 13th century, the Mongols conquered China. Under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty ruled the entire country. For nearly a century, there was little reason to strengthen a northern frontier against the very people governing the empire. Many older defensive walls simply fell into neglect as attention shifted elsewhere. Everything changed once the Yuan dynasty collapsed. In the late 14th century, the Ming dynasty drove the Mongols out of China and reclaimed imperial rule. But although the Mongols no longer occupied Beijing, they remained powerful across the northern steppe. Raids continued, frontier settlements remained vulnerable, and every emperor understood that the threat had not disappeared. This time, the Ming rulers chose a different strategy. Rather than relying mainly on campaigns deep into Mongolia, they invested enormous resources into creating the strongest frontier defences China had ever seen. The wall most people recognise today is largely the work of the Ming dynasty. Unlike the earlier rammed earth fortifications, Ming engineers built with carefully cut stone blocks and millions of bricks. Workers filled the interior with packed earth and rubble before covering it with durable masonry. The result was a broad, solid structure capable of supporting soldiers, horses, and supply carts moving along its top. Construction followed the landscape with remarkable skill. Walls climbed steep mountain ridges, crossed narrow valleys, and wound along cliffs that already offered natural protection. Engineers rarely fought against the terrain. Instead, they allowed mountains to become part of the defence itself. Looking at some sections today, it almost seems as though the wall grew directly from the rock beneath it. Thousands of watchtowers rose at regular intervals. Large fortresses guarded major passes, while barracks, armories, granaries and stables supported permanent military garrisons. Entire frontier towns developed around these strongholds, creating a living defensive network rather than an empty line of stone. The project demanded extraordinary resources. Generations of labourers, soldiers, skilled masons, engineers, and local craftsmen contributed to its construction. Stone had to be quarried, bricks fired in enormous kilns, timber transported across mountains, and food delivered to remote work sites. Building the wall required as much logistical planning as many military campaigns. The Ming emperors knew they could never eliminate every danger from the north. That was not the goal. Their ambition was to create a frontier so formidable that raids became harder, invasions slower, and every approaching enemy visible long before reaching China's heartland. It was the most ambitious version of the Great Wall ever built. A monument not only to engineering, but to centuries of hard-earned experience defending one of history's longest and most challenging frontiers. For a structure so famous, the Great Wall has inspired one surprisingly common debate. Did it actually work? The honest answer is yes. No. It depends entirely on what you expected it to accomplish. If the wall's purpose had been to create an impenetrable barrier that no enemy could ever cross, then history clearly shows it failed. Several invading armies entered China despite its towering defences, and some even conquered the entire empire. But if the wall was designed to make invasions slower, more expensive, easier to detect, and far more difficult to organise, then it often succeeded remarkably well. The wall was never meant to fight alone. Its greatest victories were often the battles that never happened. Imagine a group of mounted raiders approaching the frontier. Without defensive walls, they might ride directly into farming villages before anyone realised they had crossed the border. Livestock would disappear, homes would burn, and by the time soldiers arrived, the attackers might already be far back on the steppe. The Great Wall changed that calculation completely. Raiders now had to search for guarded passes, climb difficult terrain, or attack fortified gates defended by professional soldiers. Every delay increased the chances that beacon fires would be lit, reinforcements summoned, and nearby communities warned to prepare. Even if the attackers eventually crossed, surprise had often been lost.